Check out my shop linked below to get a cool shirt or poster. Tag me with yours on Twitter or Instagram if you want to get featured in a video. There is almost nothing more synonymous with the Vietnam War than the air cavalry. The chop of helicopter blades, the funny hats, so classic. Part of this was simply tradition. The 1st Cavalry Division was the US Army's first air mobile division. However, the bulk of the 1st Cavalry was air assault infantry with cav traditions. A more specialized type of air cavalry is the kind focused on aerial reconnaissance and security, a type that still operates in the US Army today. This video is going to cover the 60-year evolution of divisional air cavalry. To keep the video concise and simplify a complicated timeline, I'm going to keep the scope narrowed to just air cav, part of maneuver divisions. Armored cavalry regiments and air cavalry brigades probably deserve their own videos. In 1961, before the 1st Cavalry Division ever became air mobile, the Army implemented the Reorganization of Army Divisions, or ROAD. This force redesign was the result of the Kennedy administration's shift towards a flexible response doctrine, stating the Army should be able to fight both the nuclear big war and the non-nuclear small wars. This was an about-face from the Eisenhower administration's strategy focused mainly on nuclear deterrence. Full video on the Army's ill-fated pentomic force design linked on screen now. Among many organizational changes to make Army divisions more practical, the number of aircraft basically doubled. What was once an aviation company under the pentomic model became an aviation battalion with airlift and general support helicopters. But at the same time, a company-sized air cavalry troop was added to the division's battalion-sized armored cavalry squadron, besides an HQ and HQ troop and 3 armored cavalry troops, or 2 airborne cavalry troops in airborne divisions. But when the 1st Cavalry Division became an air mobile division in 1965, they had an air cavalry squadron. It was the reverse of an armored cav squadron, with 3 air cavalry troops and only 1 ground cavalry troop mainly mounted on jeeps. The purpose of the air cav troop was to extend the reconnaissance and security effort with both aerial reconnaissance and air mobile ground reconnaissance. It was more well suited to operations in undeveloped areas and rough terrain than the armored cavalry, and was an interesting combined arms unit in its own right. The troop consisted of a troop HQ, Operations Section, Aero Scout Platoon, Aero Rifle Platoon, Aero Weapons Section, and a Service Platoon. This structure was basically a scaled-up version of the Sky Cavalry Platoon formed in 1957 to test air mobile tactics. The AirCav Troops Aero Scout Platoon consisted of a platoon HQ with 1 H-13K observation helicopter, 2 light sections, each with 4 H-13s, and a heavy section with 4 HU-1B utility helicopters armed with SS-11 anti-tank guided missiles. This provided the troop with visual reconnaissance, particularly over large areas, relevant for nuclear damage assessment but also jungle operations. It also provided an anti-armor capability useful for offensive action and delaying enemy armor as part of its security mission. Security involves putting oneself between the friendly main force and the enemy so they don't sneak up on you. And one thing that could be even better than telling the commander the enemy is coming is destroying the enemy before they even get there. Using that air mobility and AT weapons to lead the main force, especially during a pursuit or exploitation in the enemy's rear, can also allow the commander to maintain more constant pressure on the fleeing enemy and speed up the advance of ground forces. The Aero Rifle Platoon, meanwhile, consisted of 4 9-man rifle squads carried in 5 utility helicopters. Initially, the UH-1 Bravo, and later, the long-body UH-1 Delta. Initially, the helicopters in the Aero Rifle Platoon were assigned to the Platoon HQ, but later in the conflict, they were split into a dedicated airlift section with their own lieutenant in charge. This platoon gave the AirCav troop the ability to seize lightly defended terrain, conduct ground infiltrations, ambushes, and reconnaissance, especially of areas that can't be reconnoitered well from the air, like a canopy-covered jungle, establish ground observation posts, and rescue downed air crews. Lastly, the Aero Weapons section included 4 UH-1 Bravo or Charlie utility helicopters with 2.75-inch rocket launchers. This section could act as an armed escort for other helicopters during air assaults and aerial recon, isolate a landing zone with rocket fire to enable the landing of the air rifles, and provide close air support to ground troops and scouts with far more precision than artillery. Doctrinally, an air cav reconnaissance would be led by the scouts, followed by the commander, weapons, and rifles in that order. The troop headquarters and flight operations section each had a utility helicopter for command and control, as did the maintenance and supply sections and the service platoon for emergency transport of spare parts and mechanics. These elements would all support each other and be task organized as a rule. From the earliest days of Vietnam, they took to calling the Aero Scouts the Whites, the Air Rifles the Blues, and the Air Weapons the Reds. For example, 2 gunships would be a red team, and 2 light scouts would be a white team. But a composite team with 1 scout for spotting targets and 1 or more gunships for engaging would be a pink team. A gunship would always operate with at least another gunship or observation helicopter for target acquisition purposes. By the late 1960s, the Air Cav troop was largely similar, although new helicopters started to be introduced. As of a 1967 MTO, the OH-13 Sioux was replaced with the new OH-6 Cayuse, colloquially called the Loach. The improved UH-1 Hotel also started to replace the UH-1 Delta in the air rifles. But by the early 1970s, the Heavy Scouts were disbanded. This coincided with the adoption of the AH-1 Golf Cobra attack helicopter. At that time, the Aero Weapons section and the Heavy Scout section with their UH-1 gunships were replaced by an Aero Weapons platoon with 9 Cobras. It also seemed to have been planned for the platoon HQ to have a second Cobra to functionally provide 2 weapons sections with 5 Cobras each. This was mentioned in the 1969 Air Cav Squadron Field Manual and a 1969 report from the 164th Aviation Group, although as a future state to replace the 9-ship standard. However, by a 1971 organization table, 9 Cobras was again the standard, and it stayed that way for a while. The new OH-58 Kiowa also began operating alongside the Loach in 1969. The reason for this quick replacement was basically after the OH-6 beat Bell's Model 206 in the 1965 Light Observation Helicopter Contest, the Army recompeted the contract in 1967, prompted by production issues and a corresponding price hike in the Loach. Bell resubmitted a refined Model 206A, which won out against the OH-6 and was selected as the OH-58 Alpha. Around 1969, shortly before the Kiowa was introduced, the Aero Scout platoon was enlarged from 9 to 10 scouts. In a TO&E, this looked like 2 helicopters in the platoon HQ rather than 1, but in practice, it meant 2 sections of 5 helicopters. Unlike in the Aero Weapons platoon, the 10-ship Aero Scout platoon persisted beyond Vietnam. But by the 1979 reference data, change 10 of that table of organization, there were some minor alterations. For example, the first Aero Weapons section remained on the initial AH-1 Golf attack helicopter, but the second was authorized 4 AH-1 Sierra helicopters equipped to use the new TOW anti-tank guided missile. In this table, the Aero Rifles were also then referred to as the Recon Platoon, and although the squads were little different, the riflemen were redesignated as Scouts. By Change 13 in the early 1980s, sorry for jumping around, I don't have every single TOW change, the UH-1 in the Troop HQ was replaced with a Kiowa. The Aero Scout sections were both brought back to 4 helicopters for a total of 9 in the platoon. In infantry, air mobile, and airborne divisions, the number of recon squads also went from 4 to 3, with only 4 UH-1 hotels to lift them, although armored and mechanized division troops still had 4 squads, and both Aero Weapons sections were equipped with a tow-capable AH-1 Sierra. However, going into the 1980s with the Army of Excellence reorganization, there were more fundamental changes. At the troop level, the service platoon was taken out completely. Maintenance and supply elements were centralized at the squadron level. The troop headquarters elements were also stripped back significantly, and the ground recon capability was disbanded. What was left was an Aero Scout platoon with 6 OH-58 Charlie Scout helicopters and an attack helicopter platoon with 4 helicopters. Division 86 plans in the early 1980s anticipated the yet-to-be-adopted AH-64 Apache, although by the end of the 1980s, aircav troops outside of Europe were still doctrinally fielding the AH-1 Sierra. However, the AH-64 Alpha was fielded by air cavalry in Europe along with the Cobra and did redeploy from Germany to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. The OH-58 Delta Kiowa Warrior also entered service in the 80s. Under Army of Excellence, the allotment of air cavalry troops also changed at the squadron level. While after Vietnam it essentially became a split between the armor-heavy Armored Cav Squadron and the air-heavy Air Cav Squadron, by the late 1980s, Heavy Division Cav Squadrons would have 2 ground and 2 air cav troops. Light divisions would have 2 light ground and 2 air cav troops. The Air Assault Division would have 4 air cav troops plus about a company's worth of UH-60 Blackhawks in the headquarters troop, but no ground troops. And the Airborne Division would have 3 air cav troops and a motorized ground troop. In addition to these elements, Army aviation battalions and squadrons added an aviation unit maintenance company in 1989 or 1990. This was done by separating those assets from the headquarters companies and troops, so it was more of a shifting around than a whole addition. Also worth noting under Army of Excellence, Division Cav Squadrons were transferred to the new Division Aviation Brigades. That was despite there being ground recon elements in those squadrons. This was mainly to streamline sustainment for the helicopters, but the cavalry was tactically employed by the division commander. By the late 90s, under the Force Projection series of TOWs, the air cavalry troop structure had been simplified to 2 platoons with 4 aircraft each. In most divisions, these could either be entirely OH-58 armed scouts or AH-1 attack helicopters, but no longer a mix within the same troop. At the squadron level, Heavy Division Cavalry added a 3rd ground troop, as had been desired in the mid-1980s but not resourced with Army of Excellence. Light infantry divisions had also lost one of their ground troops sometime in the 90s. This is reflected in a 1991 manual. This state continued until the division's demise as a proper tactical unit in the mid-2000s. As part of the US Army's 2004-2006 Modular Force reform, brigades were permanently converted into self-contained, independently deployable units of action. Whereas before, an armored brigade would normally be task organized as a brigade combat team by the parent division, that BCT configuration became permanent. Divisional cavalry assets were replaced by reconnaissance squadrons at the brigade level, but they didn't have aviation. Meanwhile, aviation brigades became aviation units of action with 3 designs. All of them had 2 attack reconnaissance formations, 1 assault helicopter battalion, 1 general support battalion, 1 aviation support battalion, and a headquarters. The difference was in the heavy design. The 2 attack recon battalions were AH-64 Apache units under aviation regiments. While in the medium design, 1 battalion was a cavalry squadron with Kiowa armed scout helicopters, and in the light design, both were cavalry squadrons with Kiowas. For example, the Heavy 1st Air Cavalry Brigade came to have 1 227 and 4 227 as attack battalions, 2 227 as general support, and 3 227 as assault. While the medium 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade had 117 Cav as a Kiowa squadron, 182 as an Apache attack battalion, 382 as general support, and 282 as assault. Interestingly, the 101st Airborne Division had 2 medium cabs, the 101st and 159th cabs. And finally, the Light 25th Combat Aviation Brigade included 26 and 617 Cavalry as Kiowa squadrons, 325 as general support, and 225 as assault. There were some non-standard modifications during this time frame though. For example, in the 10th Mountain Division, elements of the Kiowa-equipped 6.6 Cavalry and Apache-equipped 110 Aviation came together to form a composite flight company with 6 Kiowas and 6 Apaches. But even units that didn't directly integrate Kiowas and Apaches in the same companies, which was basically all of them, there was doctrine for task organizing dual scout weapons teams. An example would be a Kiowa warrior from an attack recon troop acting as a wingman and air mission commander, while an Apache from an attack recon company acted as the lead. In that setup, the Kiowa warrior, ideally manned by a troop commander, platoon leader, or senior warrant officer, would direct the team, focus on reconning the objective, communicating with higher up, marking targets, and coordinating with ground forces. The Apache, meanwhile, being the more heavily armed helicopter, would engage targets, protect the Kiowa, and guide the Kiowa if the Apache made contact with the enemy first. This was basically the ultimate evolution of the Pink Team of early Vietnam, with OH-13 Scouts and UH-1 Bravo gunships, and the later OG Kiowa and Cobra Scout weapons teams that persisted into the 90s. Although efforts like that wouldn't save the armed scout. The current state of standardized air cavalry squadrons came about in the 2015-2016 timeframe as a result of a comprehensive army reorganization announced in 2013. At that time, the attack recon squadron and the light aviation brigades converted from the OH-58 Delta Kiowa Warrior to the AH-64 Apache. In the heavy divisions, one of the attack recon battalions reflagged into an attack reconnaissance squadron, later called an air cavalry squadron. To set them apart from the Apache-only attack battalions, 3 platoons of RQ-7 Shadow drones were also added to the aircav squadron. These were integrated at 1 UAS platoon per company-sized aircav troop. So today, each Divisional Combat Aviation Brigade has 1 air cavalry squadron with the same design regardless if the division is heavy or light. Its purpose is to provide accurate and timely information to the commander by conducting reconnaissance missions, give the division time and space to react to the enemy by conducting security missions, and defeat, delay, divert, and disrupt enemy forces by conducting security or strike missions. The attack battalion with just Apaches has the same mission profile, but are less capable in reconnaissance and security tasks due to the lack of organic drones. The squadron includes a headquarters and headquarters troop, 3 air cavalry troops, an aviation maintenance troop, and a 4 support troop to provide multifunctional logistics. The air cavalry troops in turn consist of a small troop HQ, 2 attack recon platoons, and a Shadow unmanned aircraft system platoon. Each attack recon platoon consists of 4 Apaches. It has 1 lieutenant as platoon leader, while the rest of the pilots are warrant officers. Ground-based crew chiefs are also allotted to the platoons. The platoons are authorized fewer pilots than necessary to man all the Apaches because the company commander and 3 warrant officers in the troop HQ also act as pilots. The platoons are mainly administrative constructs though. In combat, the Apaches would be task organized into elements as small as a 2-ship scout weapon team. I'm not sure if this is still doctrine, but back in the late 90s, it was assumed that an attack helicopter company with 8 helicopters would functionally have 6 helicopters or 3 2-ship teams, with 75% being fully mission capable at any one time. In that situation, each team would have either the company commander or platoon leader to provide mission command. Although if all helicopters are in the air at once, one would presumably be left with a senior warrant officer in charge. The troop has a total of 3 longbow fire control radars. That's the saucer you see above the rotor on some Apaches. As a separate piece of equipment from the helicopter itself, it can be installed on any Delta or Echo Apache to provide tracking for up to 128 targets and simultaneous engagement. In footage, you'll often see the longbow-equipped Apache paired with those without, as target data can be shared with other Apaches. The Shadow Platoon, meanwhile, has the necessary equipment to launch, recover, and control 4 RQ-7B V2 Shadow UAVs. With an endurance of about 9 hours in the air, the platoon is equipped to conduct 3 missions a day to provide 24-hour coverage, although they can surge up to 2 drones in the air at once to provide more aerial surveillance coverage, but unsustainably. While the Shadow is unarmed, it does have sensors and a laser designator that can guide in Hellfires launched by Concealed Apache, basically how Kyle was buddy-laced for Apaches back in the day. That cooperation is called MUM-T, which I thoroughly explain in this video on US Army large drone operations. I'll see you over there.